coming. Also, at the beginning, I want to mention there's a sign-in sheet that's going around for the Center of European Studies, so you can be sure to sign in. I think they're taking emails and those sort of information. But again, thank you all for coming. My name is Ben Brower. I'm a professor in the history department, and I'm here to open our discussion for this afternoon. And I want to, first of course, thank our sponsor, and I also want to tell you a little bit about the program under which Professor Dakhlia has come to the United States, to UT today. Now, this is part of an exchange that UT has undertaken with the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, France. And it's organized here with myself, Ari Adid, Maya Sharad, and Terry Gibbons, Sociology, Government, and also from the Department of Middle Eastern Studies, Tariq El-Aris. We've been working on this for the last 3 years. We're doing it under the auspices of the Center for European Studies. So I'd like to, of course, thank its director, Douglas Biao. I'd also like to thank Charlotte Harris and excuse me, Sally Dixon, who are here and have done a lot of work to bring Professor Dakhlia here with us today in terms of logistics, funding, organization. And basically, the Center for European Studies, just I'd like to thank them for providing a very stimulating forum for a place to think at UT about Europe, its past, its place in the world, its future, and so forth. So in the past 3 years, the framework in which we do this exchange is through examining the question of Europe and Islam. And we've done this through a series of very stimulating exchanges, whereby we bring a person from the École here to UT, and we send one of our people to Paris to give a talk, share their work, and to plot different sorts of ways that we can think about this question of Europe and Islam. The question has some urgency at the moment, and one in particular where the social sciences and humanities, I think, have a very important role to play in these ongoing debates that are going on in civil society and politics. Sometimes a corrective role for what's going on in the public domain. And in many ways, it's an important place for us to do some reevaluation of our own work, assumptions, and practices, and so forth. So far, we brought to UT from Paris, Lucette Valency. She was our first guest. Last year, Jean-Philippe Bras came and shared some of his work. And also, a person in France who I'd like to thank here publicly, although he's not here with us today, is Mouloud Haddad, who has just finished his dissertation, his doctorat at the École when this program started. He was very instrumental in putting things together in terms of the logistics and so forth. From UT, we've sent our own Terry Gibbons from the Government Department, Mary Newberger from the History Department, and this year Sophia Marabit from Anthropology will be going to Paris in the spring to share some of his work on sexuality and Islam. Now today we are delighted to welcome Jocelyne Dakhlia here, a specialist of Mediterranean Islam, who has come to share some of her work with us today. She's a director of studies at the EHSS, if I can, it doesn't really come across very well in English, at the École, if you will, where she's been since 1990. She's co-director of the venerable French journal Annales, and editor of the most important French language periodicals in Middle East Studies in France, the Revue des Mondes Musulmans and Arabica. She is the author of 6 books, including a landmark 2008 study of the common language spoken by people in the early modern Mediterranean entitled Lingua Franca. And she has edited 4 books, including 2 volumes of Les Musulmans dans l'Histoire de l'Europe, the Muslims in the History of Europe, that have only recently appeared in 2011 and 2013. She is a scholar of truly international reputation, speaking widely across Europe, the Middle East, and the United States. She was last in the United States last fall in a conference at Berkeley. And today she will talk to us about invisible strangers, Muslims in early modern France and Britain, 1500 to 1800. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dakhlia.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for this generous introduction. This is my very first visit to Texas, and I do enjoy it a lot. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to give a talk about this collaborative research on the Mediterranean and Muslims in Western Europe in the early modern period mostly. My talk will be in English, but I have to apologize for my bad English, especially when it comes to question. Maybe I shall answer the questions in French if you don't care. Maybe. So to illustrate what seems to have been the experience of people from Islamic societies living in Europe during most of the early modern period, let me describe to you a common contemporary situation. When you go to a restaurant in Paris today, regardless of the type of cuisine, Italian, French, even Japanese, there's a good chance that the person or persons preparing your food will be Southern Asians, often Tamil. Tamils and Sri Lankans are well represented in Paris restaurant kitchens. But never do French people take this increasingly substantial reality into account in the image they have of their country's immigrant population. A growing Southern Asian population, increasingly integrated, whose children go to French schools, yet they simply don't figure as a group in French civic or political debate because they are not seen or talked about. The foreigners that the French do talk about are North Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, possibly Turks, that is to say primarily Muslims. But the increasing number of Egyptian immigrants, for example, who work primarily in the construction sector, has not registered in the public mind either. Clearly, there is a disparity between the image the society has of its foreign and immigrant population and the actual composition of that population. What then does it mean to see in this context? What constitutes a visible group? What explains whether or not a group becomes visible? As Zimmel put it in his well-known Excursus of the Stranger, strangers do have an internal position. In order to be able even to call someone a stranger, we have to recognize that person as being present among us. The question of the invisible stranger is therefore already a paradoxical one. And yet, that is the phenomenon we are confronted with. We know these people are there, but we don't talk about them. They are part of group life, part of the wider, encompassing community, yet they are simply not mentioned. Muslims living in Europe, Western Europe, prior to the 19th century, or at least before the instituting of colonial relations in and over Muslim nations, seem to me a compelling example of this type of social paradox. In European and Maghrebian historiography alike, pre-19th century circulation of Muslims in Europe has long been presented as exceptional, involving a few isolated individuals only. This, of course, means it was inconceivable to speak of Muslim integration or assimilation in Europe before the 20th century. In a major work edited by Mohamed Arkoun and published in France in 2006, just a few years ago, Muslims present in France during the early modern period are said to have been just visitors, not settlers. The book discusses Muslim slave embassies in France at some length, but the possibility of Muslims being integrated into French society is mentioned only in connection with a few exceptional cases. Recent historiography on Southern Europe has led to reconsidering the question. In the last few years, probably because of increased interest in slavery and captivity conditions in the Mediterranean basin, historians have become very attentive to the population mixing induced by privateering and slavery practices in the early modern period. Still, outside of Italy, Spain, and Malta, there has not been much inquiry into possible integration or assimilation of Muslims in Western Europe. Given the existence of galleys in Marseille, for example, it seems reasonable to think that the situation in Provence was fairly similar to the one in Italy, that is in Naples or Livorno. But Marseille and Provence have not been studied to the same degree. There were hundreds of Muslim oarsmen in France. 1/5 of the galley oarsmen in France were Muslims. How much were they in Spain or in the Low Countries, we don't know. The rest of France would seem even less relevant to such research. In monographs on French villages, regions, cities, some of which are relatively early texts, we find occasional mentions of, I quote, a converted Turk or a Moor who became a Christian. All local historians and monographs note such cases as curiosities or exceptions. But once there are 200 to 300 of them, can they still be called exceptions? At any rate, this obscure, highly dispersed population of converts from Islam has not yet been the focus of sustained research. There were no galleys in Britain, and the presence of Muslims there at the start of the early modern period is even harder to document. Though a crop of recent books and articles has quite rightly resituated Britain within Mediterranean history, many studies of the country's relations with Islam are based on literature and theatre, and therefore on constructed images and representations of the Muslim, the Moor, rather than on historical inquiry. And the few historical studies that have been done are likely to focus on Britons who became Turks or simply discovered the world of Islam in the course of their travels, rather than on the other side and moves in the other direction. To this day, very few historians or specialists of English literature have even inquired into the assimilation of Moors and Turks in Britain. Nabil Matar is one of them. But there is much historical evidence that many Turks and Moors were employed on English ships, either captives or free men, just as English sailors worked for the Turks. Clearly then, Europeans, even today, have a hard time seeing this circulation and integration phenomena as two-sided, reciprocal. First, it is hard for them to see people of Islam, either free or captive, circulating in Europe in the same way Europeans circulated in the Islamic world. Second, it is hard for them to see circulation and integration of Muslims as phenomena affecting all of Western Europe, not just regions in immediate contact with the Islamic world. I would certainly not deny that a city like Venice received more Turks than, say, London or Paris, and was more familiar with phenomena related to the integration of Oriental populations. But we shouldn't inquire into the expansion of French or British commerce in the Levant in the 17th and 18th centuries, or the ways that the Europeans involved in those developments were creolized by them, without at least asking whether a symmetrical, reciprocal phenomenon was occurring on European territory. Thus far, our collaborative research on Western Europe and my study of French and British sources from the modern period made me found several hundred men and thousands of them, in fact, men and women originally from Islamic society. For some, there is no more than a name, a few lines, 2 lines. What can we make of such fragmentary traces? How can we get them to talk? And how many of them were they in reality? As I see it, we can distinguish 4 levels or angles on the question of Muslims' integration in and into Western Europe in the modern period, in the early modern period. In fact, they amount to 4 types of difficulties or impediments. The first difficulty is the historiographic opacity I just mentioned. The question was inconceivable. Researchers simply did not hypothesize that any Islamic individuals or populations were becoming integrated into Western Europe. From British archives, for instance, we learned that in 1532 in London, 2 women joined the Domus Conversorum, an institution created in the Middle Ages to convert Jews to Christianity. Their names were Aïssa Poudeouia and Omelfeit Aïssia. And writing in the 1930s, the historian Michael Adler identified these women as Jews. Of course, he added their names did sound a little strange, possibly Oriental or Moorish Jews. Today, it is clear he should have wondered whether those names were not in fact Muslim. One was obviously Aisha, the name of the Prophet Muhammad's favorite wife, and the other woman's name, Isya, was very similar, or close to Esya, like Esya Jeba. In a recent essay on marginalized others in Shakespeare, an American academic mentions this case but does not envisage the possibility that a woman named Aisha could be Muslim. I would certainly not go so far as to affirm that the two women were Muslim, but the fact that scholars from the 1930s until today did not even envisage the hypothesis seems to me a genuine problem. Not all historians of all times excluded the possibility that the strangers in question were Muslims. In 1921, Jules Matorès, a French historian, in a long work on foreigners in France under the Ancien Regime, devoted a substantial section to what he called an Oriental population. This included Armenians, Greeks, and Jews, as well as former Saracens or modern Turks. Matorès concluded that the French population contained few Turks, that is, Muslims, and stressed their, I quote, limited ability to move up the social ladder. Clearly, his thinking was imprisoned in the colonial mold. However, he did see the question quite clearly, whereas its visibility regressed in studies by later historians. Awareness of the phenomenon was more widespread in the second half of the 19th century and beginning of the 20s than in the years that followed. The reason for the shrinking visibility of these people in historical writings is clear. Between the two world wars, Europe's colonial grip stiffened, relations between colonizer and colonized became harsher, and there was tighter self-censorship on slavery practices within Europe. The second difficulty has to do not with historiography, but the primary sources themselves. As explained, evidence of a Muslim presence in Europe often amounts to the barest of mentions. One problem is that integration usually implied changing one's name, Christianizing it. As in the case of the two women in 16th century London, one of them became Catherine and the other one Mary Cook. Whether or not the person was actually baptized is another question, but early in the early modern period, in the 16th century, assimilation usually implied taking a Christian name. This, of course, means that people who were originally Muslim vanish as such from the sources, especially at the beginning of this period. From that, I have been able to find from the mid-17th century, people at that time were more likely to keep their birth name and add a Christian one to it. And this double name system seems to have spread. So we find such combinations as Charles, Ali, and Nicolas, Mustafa, Henri, Sherif, and so on. Later still, in the 18th century, Muslim names are sometimes mentioned alone, including for persons who had been baptized, converts to Christianity. This was the case, for instance, in the 1720s in Paris, for one Mustafa Aha, who had been an officer and cavalier in the Ordre de Saint-Louis, and so necessarily a Christian, but obviously his Turkish birth name was preserved. Should this be understood as an effect of the overall secularizing of society at that time? Perhaps integration no longer had to mean Christianization, either real or invented. Or is it an indication that the French society itself was becoming ethnicized? That is to say, people had to keep their birth names, their native identities, regardless of whether they had converted or not. In any case, the gradual disappearance of slavery and the galleys during the early modern period and the subsiding of privateering wars meant that at the end of the period, more free persons were circulating more freely. In fact, there was probably more population mixing early on in the period, when privateering was at its height, but such mixing was not very visible because of the name changes I mentioned. In the late 18th and early 19th century, we find individuals with Christian or European names with evidence that they had not been baptized. At Montauban, in the first years of the 19th century, for example, lived a stage actor and former officer named Sieur Stéphanie, Italian name, and only at the age of 60, after officially declaring himself Muslim, did he ask to be baptized in response to the pleas and prayers of his French wife. He had been living for 20 years in France and married without being baptized. This case suggests a third possible explanation for the invisibility of individual cases, namely the blending in strategies such individuals may have had the intention to make themselves invisible. In any event, well, the word strategy always bothers me because it presupposes that people have some degree of agency when often they have none, or at least not as much as we would like to believe or demonstrate. In any event, given the name-changing practices, it seems fair to say that at the beginning of the early modern period, the rule was to efface one's Islamic origin or keep it under social wraps. In the 18th century, on the other hand, particularly the second half, we find increasing numbers of individuals publicly declaring themselves Muslims. This was surely due in large part to the fact that the system had been put in place to check the identities of circulating individuals. It became more or less crucial for everyone to have a stable name, and people were more likely than before to have to make official identity statements. In England, people began declaring themselves Muslims at court trials. They swore on the Al-Quran rather than the Bible. Nevertheless, it came with a new phenomenon. Oriental Christians wishing to open a coffee or tea shop could evoke Muslimness by figuring the turbaned head of a Turk on their shop signs, forgetting their Christian identity. In France at this time, people of somewhat uncertain identity began orientalizing themselves in the same way, making it impossible to say whether they were Jews, Greeks, Armenians, or actually Turks, that is to say Muslims. Before I give you an example, let me just formulate the fourth and last aspect of the Muslim invisibility problem. At a given moment in its history, what does a society allow or enable people to do, and what does it render impossible for them? What does a society accept to see, and what does it refuse to see? Interestingly, there seems to have been a great deal of tolerance for identity mixing, or at least for maintaining a certain vagueness about one's identity. Let me borrow an example from Claude Quetel's study of witch hunts at the close of the reign of Louis XIV. In the first years of the 18th century, a vast police operation was launched in Paris that led to the arrest of an entire series of witches. The police arrested a man named Baptiste, dressed as an Armenian, but claiming to be a baptized Turk. The source reads, who says he's a Turk. Baptiste wanted to be thought of as, I quote, a good Catholic. It was also discovered that he practiced witchcraft with a rod inscribed with Hebrew characters. This Baptiste, and the name was common among converts, thus presented an extremely confused identity, indeed several identities, yet all of them implied Orientalness. And he was clearly not the least concerned about the fundamental contradictions that might be seen between them. Other figures seem instead to have blended in perfectly with their environment. They only appear in the sources because of some chance event or request for baptism. How can we explain the fact that there are so few signs of social intolerance toward these Turks or Moors who had arrived in France and Britain, albeit in droplets rather than waves, and become integrated into the population of this or that village or city. The fact that there is no mention of major incidents in the judiciary archives is no proof of harmonious integration, of course, nor does it prove that there was no hostility toward these strangers. Still, it is important to inquire into the considerable gap between the sharply hostile discourse that might be heard against Turks at the time, developed on theological or diplomatic grounds, and the invisible integration of hundreds of thousands of Muslims in these regions, while the general policy of both France and Britain toward the Ottomans and the Sultan of Morocco was one of rapprochement. The religion in question in particular remained a sharp dividing line in geopolitical discourse, in striking contrast to what seems to have been peaceful or at least relatively problem-free cohabitation on the territory of these Christian nations. I will not hazard a theological comparison of Judaism and Islam, but I would like to suggest a fundamentally religious reason or set of reasons for the paradox of invisible Islam that I have observed for the period in both France and Britain. In reconstituting the three monotheisms, Jews and Muslims are nearly always lumped together alongside Christianity. Clerics of the early modern period often mentioned the two non-Christian groups together, like a couple, the two sets of infidels that had to be converted. But in fact, the positions assigned to Jews and Muslims from a theological or political standpoint were not at all the same. In France at that time, there were synagogues, for example, some of which still stand today, whereas the only mosques of which there is any trace in the sources are the mosque of the galley slaves in Marseille, and possibly some informal places of worship for men in the galleys at Toulon, or another example is Villefranche-sur-Mer, where there is an Arabic inscription for a room of prayers erected in the 18th century. There were surely a few other places here and there where Muslims could worship, but this must have been done in secret, in hiding, dissimulated, or else there would have to have been tacit tolerance in the social environment. In any case, Muslim worshippers would not have had any officially recognized status, a situation that does contrast to the one for Judaism. I'm not saying that Jews were treated better than Muslims, that's not the point. The issue is visibility in the public space, and 2 points seem decisive here. The first is theological. Christianity claimed to have moved beyond Judaism. Jews had to be converted, of course, but they were already there before Christianity, and this meant their presence was to some degree legitimate. It was a presence that irritated the Christian environment, of course, giving rise to all sorts of harassment and persecution, but the confrontation was, in a way, face-to-face. The relation was one of visibility. Muslims, on the other hand, were structurally outside. Theologically, they claimed to have moved beyond Christianity. They were even thought of as heretics, deviants that had quit the bosom of the church, like Protestants. And by the way, Protestants in their memoirs often said at the time that they were buried with Turks as a persecution. And politically, Muslims were subjects of threatening strong states. They therefore constituted a potential external threat. It was impossible to think of them as inside, impossible to imagine them belonging. And it's in a way the same today. It is this structural position that seems to me to explain the fact that mosques were not publicly tolerated in the landscape until quite late in the period and are not readily tolerated today. But paradoxically, this external position may also explain why people acted as if Muslims weren't there, or as if they were just passing through. That is to say, why there was such strong denial of perfectly real integration processes. We could therefore define two types of acceptance of Muslims in Europe in the early modern period. One requiring exemplary theatrical conversion. The other, tacit tolerance, made possible in part by the fact that the natives confused or assimilated these peoples to Jews or Oriental Christians, what I would call stream identities. This in turn facilitating tacit, fairly consensual integration. Of course, the possibility of playing on other Oriental identities, either deliberately or implicitly, was surely stronger in regions remote from the Islamic world than it was in Mediterranean ports, for example. I cannot imagine people in southern European cities confusing Oriental Jews and Muslims, whereas such indeterminate identities were readily encountered in contexts as at some remove from the Mediterranean basin. In 17th century London, for example, there was a famous Turkish tightrope walker whose feats inspired a poem that included this line: "Some say he's a Turk, some call him a Jew." Then there's a London police report of 1752 where the suspect was a Jew. A woman claimed she had seen the Turk, then corrected herself a Jew. Another point is that most historians are in danger of being misled by the fact that much of the available documentation is in the form of baptism certificates, where Muslims only visible at the moment they ceased being Muslims. We could easily conclude that there was no place for such individuals in those societies unless they got baptized. My sense is that the reality was more complex. As I have been suggesting, there could well have been situations of tacit, mute coexistence and tolerance. Blurring Muslimness under the coat of an indeterminate encompassing Oriental identity is one of the ways for this tolerance. But in many contexts, the presence of an unbaptized Turk seems to have been clearly identified and socially assumed. For instance, there was, as I mentioned, a rope dancer. There was a Moroccan woman who ruled the rope dancers company in London at the beginning of the 18th century. And there is an advertisement just saying Moroccan woman, so a Muslim woman. A person who had practiced Islam internally all their life might be baptized on his or her deathbed, as was the case for Bernard, Turkish tapestry maker at the Louvre, baptized in 1670, the day before he died. On the other hand, there were virtually unknown, extremely discreet types of presence, revealed quite arbitrarily, almost by chance. There was Sharina, a Turkish maid, mentioned as residing in a London district in 1695. Who was she? Also in London, John Windus, in a book he was writing in the early 18th century on Morocco and Barbary, a name for North Africa at the time, noted, "We have been," I quote, "we have been pretty well accustomed to see Moroccan natives in our streets." So the tolerance for either discrete Muslim identities or blurred Oriental identities was quite effective during most of the early modern period. Why such a great tolerance? I would interpret it through a model of reciprocity, a model effective until, let's say, the middle of the 18th century. Before the middle of the 18th century, all the wars underway, privateering wars and other types, the wars between the Habsburg and the Ottomans, and all the adventuring on the Mediterranean Sea, created situations of perfectly mutual dependence. Europeans knew that their Christian co-religionists, compatriots, and in some cases close relatives, had likewise ended up in a society that was not their own, an Islamic society, that they had set out on potentially dangerous adventures in precarious conditions and could get taken captive and put up for ransom. These things happened. There was no Western supremacy at the time, so on both sides of the Mediterranean, there was a certain tolerance for any ways people had of getting by in a strange land, all the ways of acculturating and even integrating that were possible in the two sets of societies. The symmetry, reciprocity, interdependence of the situations is what seems to me to explain the apparent consensus in Europe to look the other way, accept blurry, uncertain or floating identities, together with the fact that identity systems everywhere were likely to be remarkably fluid at the time. Once again, the inviolability of proper names was only fully established in the late 18th century, if then. How much time?
2 minutes?
10 minutes?
10, 15 minutes?
Be that it may, for women too, there are two visibility modes. First, exemplary cases, extremely few and far between, and well documented. They concern mostly very young women carried off of battlefields, who either ended up in convents or found themselves in more scandalous environments. Second, cases of anonymous or barely named servants, like Sharina, Turkish maid, for whom we have next to no biographical indications. Here we are confronted with the source invisibility of subalterns, or as in the case of today's Tamil restaurant cooks, social invisibility of subalterns. Also characteristic of women, and the same is found for European women in Islamic societies, is the fact that they were very unlikely to return to their society of origin. In contrast to men who did have this possibility, very few women had obtained the right to an opportunity to return home. In most cases, they just married or they were concubines with their children, just settled and invisible. As I see it, the Turks' otherness only came to be systematically designated by physical, racial criteria relatively late in the period, maybe in the second half of the 18th century. Until that point, the main difference was religion. Moreover, black-skinned Moors, black Moors as they were called in English, do not seem to have been associated spontaneously or by nature with Islam. In other words, during much of the early modern period, there does not seem to have been any strong connection between hostility toward Islam and hostility toward blacks or dark-skinned people. The changes observed in the second half of the 18th century applied to both France and Britain. First, there were the name changes I indicated, together with the continued social use of the person's birth name even after baptism, as was the case for certain Mustafa I've mentioned. The stranger became more ethnic, and after what may be called a problematic of assimilation that dissolved or blurred all differences, we find evidence of a problematic of integration in which markers of difference were preserved. At this time, too, we find increasing evidence of racism against these individuals, namely in the judiciary archives, reports of growls, insults. Is this a source-created bias? After all, such incidents may well have been occurring all along. Was it the tightening of police surveillance and control and the new practice of identity checks that explain why the number and details of such cases increase in 18th century sources? or were these individuals beginning to represent a social problem because of their origin, whereas before they had figured either as trophies won by the Christian faith or virtuous poor people who had ultimately chosen Europe? Again, it is hard to choose between these interpretations. It does seem to me, and this will be my last point, that the position of these strangers changed at that time. There is a break between the beginning and end of the modern period, of the early modern period. The extinction or subsiding of privateering activity seems to me a decisive development. As long as such phenomena as prisoner-taking knit together not just areas on the northern and southern shores of the Mediterranean, but also inland reaches, the Balkans, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, then Europe and the world of Islam were tied together in a relationship of interdependence. We know, for example, from the contracts that Provençal families drew up with solicitors, that it was a common practice for such families to purchase a Moorish captive so they could exchange him for a member of their own family if ever one was taken prisoner. We know very little of the history of these hostages, but the reciprocity principle is quite clear. The equilibrium between the two sides of the Mediterranean was one of symmetry and tension. As the religious and ideological conflicts became less bitter and diplomacy and business interests came to the fore, the Turk no longer inspired fear, and the Turkish, that is to say the Muslim stranger, did no longer have to be assimilated to reduce his or her difference. Now, in fact, he could readily preserve his difference. Indeed, he was a sign difference. It was at this time that Turkish cafes and bars began to proliferate, operated by Orientals in England, France, Austria, all over Europe. The move to exoticize the Turk was underway throughout Europe, but it was of particular significance in France and Britain, the two nations that would adopt and enact a colonial approach to Muslims and a position of colonial domination over them. The change becomes quite perceptible in England in the second half of the 18th century, triggered by the 1757 conquest of part of Bengal by the British East India Company. The company immediately began sending massive numbers of Indian and Bengali sailors and servants back to Britain. I would like to mention here the works of John Fisher on this new immigration. Thus began the flagrant subalternizing of Muslims and more generally natives. In France, the crucial date was 1798, Bonaparte's expedition into Egypt. From this moment forward, Europeans began systematically distinguishing Muslims, or people who had originally been Muslim, in terms of dress, appearance, name. They were in a way culturally marginalized as well as all Oriental people. Even Jews became more and more Orientalized at the time, Muslims being the most Oriental. The cultural marginalization of Muslims and natives, including the move to exoticize them, and European fascination with the Orient, meant that Muslim strangers, who for at least the previous 2 centuries had seemed to blend into the landscape, were now set apart. Paradoxically, this change also increased their social mobility. They could now become intermediaries between their society of origin and Europe. Members of several tiny minority groups, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Copts, together with a few Muslims, became entrepreneurs in France and Britain during this period. In the end, then, we are left with the eternal paradox of inquiring into the integration of Muslims when the status Muslim did not exist, either because people's membership in Islam ultimately disappeared or because they lived their religion privately, perhaps even in secret. In sum, the presence of these people was conceivable only in an environment where very little, if anything, was said of them. I certainly do not see this as a problem inherent in Islam itself, rather as a problem deriving from what I have been suggesting was the structural position of that religion in Europe. Islam is frequently defined today as a religion incompatible with any Christian society or any secularized society. The actual problem more likely derived from its historically and structurally outside position, as I was suggesting, a position we may have a better chance of understanding if we consider a span of several centuries rather than focusing on contemporary history alone. Thank you.
We're going to take some questions. Here.
I was very interested in, I know very little about Muslims in Europe. I know much more about Jews in modern Europe. But I'm interested in, and it's also not entirely clear to me when you were speaking of 17th century and when of 18th century. But you pointed out some differences at the end, I'm not too clear about them. But in terms of an invisible population in the 17th century, it might be useful to think not so much about Jews as new Christians whose identity was indeterminate, especially because they wore European dress and spoke European languages. And so I wonder about the degree of Europeanization of, for example, Turkish traders in Europe who might have spent a long time, for example, in Venice before going elsewhere, whether when they were highly Europeanized, whether they weren't invisible sort of by choice. There's a wonderful book by Mercedes, I don't know if you are familiar with it, Garcia, on Samuel Palache, who did precisely this. And it seems to have been a very common thing in Europe to, in a chameleon-like way, change identity according to the situation, situationally, sort of situationally determined identity.
Do you mind if I answer in French?
I'll try.
That's good. No, it's okay. Go ahead and I'll do a sort of summary for.
I'm sorry. Yes. Oui, merci pour votre question. En fait, elle est au cœur de notre projet. Parce que dans le livre, le premier volume, so, I should not speak in French.
You go and try in English, I think it'll work fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dans le premier volume, nous avons voulu faire cette enquête sur la présence des musulmans en Europe. Et le volume 2 est une analyse du contexte dans lequel c'était possible.
So let me just sort of, this is referring to, Doug's talking about this 2-volume collective work on the place of Muslims in Europe, and the first one was looking in particular at the context in which, the historical context in which Muslims would have found themselves in European society, and then the second volume.
Dans quelle Méditerranée est-ce que ce phénomène pouvait s'insérer et dans quelle grande circulation? Et Mercedes Garcia Arenal a participé à ce volume 2, où elle a fait un article sur les Palaches, justement. Et nous essayons effectivement de montrer qu'on est dans une période d'instabilité des identités, de constante négociation des identités, ou pour le cas des...
So Garcia Arenal published a chapter, the first chapter in the second volume, emphasizing in terms of the instability of identities at this particular time in the Western Mediterranean, and I think also in terms of Western Europe in general.
Et donc, effectivement, nous retrouvons par exemple la question de l'européanisation des nouveaux convertis avec le cas des Morisques qui arrivent en Afrique du Nord avec une identité européenne et musulmane en même temps, en sens inverse.
So the question also poses itself in North Africa, where you have the Moriscos coming from the Iberian Peninsula into North Africa with both an Oriental identity and also a European identity that they're bringing as well.
Spanish identity, Spanish
identity.
dress and language. Et pour la question des marchands, justement, c'est un point qui révèle une révision historiographique complète, puisque pendant des années, on pensait qu'il n'y avait pas, ou presque pas de marchands musulmans en Europe, et que depuis un travail pionnier, notamment de Jocelyne Dakhlia, on est en train de réévaluer toute la présence commerciale des musulmans en Europe.
Up until a recent work, on the questions of merchants, there were thought to be no Muslim merchants in Europe entirely. And new research has pointed out, in fact, in a complete historiographical revision that we need to, but there are in fact many Muslims working in Europe and so forth, and significant numbers.
Yes, but this is a new field, so we don't know a lot about them, if they were Europeanized or not.
Who is the author of this study?
It's the very first study, or one of the first studies on this topic, Jocelyne Dakhlia, who studied the death of a Turkish merchant in Venice.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, when talking about the invisible nature of this population in Europe, I work on West African populations, especially in northern Spain, but I'm also interested in Britain. And
In Spain?
Sorry?
In Spain.
In Spain mostly, but I'm also interested in Britain, and the book that came out a few years ago called Black People in the English Archives. And so I suppose the question that I'm interested in is, with very black Africans, it's harder to be invisible because of the nature of your skin color, regardless of whether you convert to Christianity and become Europeanized. So I wonder if it's useful to think about that population when analysing how Europeanized Muslim populations can become. Just kind of keeping that in mind in terms of these people have also been invisible in the archives, even though they would have been very visible in society at that time.
Je crois que sur les mondes africains, c'est une question de
Comment est-ce qu'on peut être invisible quand on a...
Voilà.
Do you mind if I answer that? Alors, c'est une question très importante parce qu'il y a cette polysémie du terme Moor. Moor qui peut être aussi bien musulman que noir ou black Moor.
Look at this separate. The important thing is in terms of the sources in the documents, the term Moor can signify either a person, a light-skinned person from North Africa, or a darker-skinned person from North Africa or from West Africa. In that respect, it's difficult. Go ahead.
Mais en fait, curieusement, il y a assez peu de connexion entre la couleur noire et le fait d'être musulman, parce que il y a eu très vite beaucoup de chrétiens noirs venant des Antilles, par exemple. Donc il y avait une déconnexion entre la religion et la couleur de la peau. Mais un autre point que je voudrais souligner à propos de la visibilité, c'est que ces individus peuvent être peu présents dans les archives historiques, mais très présents dans la littérature ou la peinture.
The question of where you look for your sources is a very important one in an official state sort of documents or institutional documents, perhaps the church. I'm sort of adding here a little bit, it's mostly the rough translation. The question of physical difference can be very, very difficult to ascertain, again, around this question more. But in other sources, in particular literary sources, there's a different sort of visibility that's possible.
Poetry or...
Thank you, that was fascinating talk. I'm not sure I heard you right, Jocelyne. Did you, the person in London, I think you said it was the 17th century, who said we see these Muslims in our streets frequently?
Yes.
Was that John Winthrop? Is that who you said?
No, it's John Windus. John Windus.
How do you spell it?
W-I-N-D-U-S.
Okay, and what year was that? Do you know? Or is this in one of the volumes?
He was with an embassy, an English embassy, the Russell embassy, I think. I have to check. And the publication date is 1725, I think.
It's interesting because the visit of a Moroccan ambassador in the 17th century was a very big deal and very public.
Yes.
And there were embassies of proto-Unitarian Englishmen who wanted to meet the Moroccan ambassador. And so it must have, you know, parading through the streets, it seems to me, is one of the ways that he might have thought about that phrase. It's very interesting. The other thing is there any evidence about how these captives from privateering or corsairing Muslim slaves, how they became free in places like France? It seems to me that that's a hard thing to do. Do we have any understanding of how that would have happened?
Well, sur,
It's okay, French is fine.
yes. Sur les ambassades marocaines, spécialement marocaines à Londres, nous avons un article de Nabil Matar, The Last Maraliba in England, or something like that, published a few years ago. Donc, il étudie finalement une certaine banalisation de la présence de ces ambassades et de leur suite. Bon, moi, ce qui m'intéresse, ce n'est pas les ambassades elles-mêmes, mais ce qu'elles révèlent de présence diffuse, soit de Marocains, soit d'autres musulmans, puisque les ambassadeurs ont un rôle d'attraction pour résoudre des problèmes, pour négocier des questions. Et
just in terms of the response was that in terms of the diplomats in Britain, the Moroccan diplomats in Britain, the Nabil Matar has written a recent article that documents that in very important ways. And Professor Dakhlia is interested in a different aspect, which is about the place about.
yes, but I have to be fair towards it. And sur les galères, les galères, c'est une question importante aussi parce que à partir des galères, on voit une diffusion aussi de population. Par exemple, ceux qui étaient christianisés pouvaient être libérés par leur parrain, marraine,
Okay, so we're talking about the galley slaves now, and those who converted to Christianity, there are processes of emancipation for these people through their patrons. I guess the patrons are on the boats, it's sort of corporate.
sometimes on the boats. Yes.
Okay.
Ou bien ils pouvaient s'enfuir.
Make
Just,
run away.
run away. Et puis aussi, les hommes des galères, l'hiver, ne voyageaient pas, n'allaient pas sur les bateaux.
So they had to stay somewhere.
Et donc ils étaient dans la ville et avaient une présence urbaine et pouvaient aussi s'échapper.
The season for flight for the galley slaves is in the winter time because the galley slaves or the galleys themselves don't go to sea at this particular time, and the rowers, the enslaved rowers, would be in the city and be easier for them to flee into the city or elsewhere.
Mais les galères n'étaient pas la seule entrée, c'était une présence visible et massive, une présence communautaire aussi dans une certaine mesure, mais il y avait aussi quantité d'immigrants qui venaient de manière libre, des réfugiés politiques, des gens qui fuyaient la famine ou la disette, des convertis libres.
There are many other types of Muslims in Europe at this time, not just the enslaved galley rowers, but there are also merchants, free populations, there are refugees, there are economic refugees and political refugees, people fleeing famine, people fleeing political persecution, that will also, Muslims will make their way to Europe as well.
Or converts, people
And free converts, yeah.
Another question. Arabic was not as popular a learned language as Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, but there were Orientalists who were interested in learning Arabic. Who taught them? So, who taught them?
C'est qui les enseignants d'arabe à l'époque?
Ah, ok.
Oui.
Oui, ça c'est. Thank you again for your question. Oui, il y a eu. La question des langues est une question qui m'intéresse beaucoup, à titre personnel. Il y a eu effectivement tout un développement de l'enseignement de l'arabe et du turc en Europe occidentale, dans différentes institutions savantes. Et on a recruté de manière privilégiée des enseignants qui appartenaient à des minorités religieuses, beaucoup de chrétiens d'Orient, beaucoup de maronites, par exemple.
Most of the translators are coming in are minority Maronites, Arabic speaking from the Eastern Mediterranean. These are people who were recruited as Arabic language instructors.
Beaucoup de maronites, de turcs. Les maronites avaient un statut privilégié à Rome.
The Maronites had a privileged status in Rome.
Mais on s'aperçoit aussi, et c'est un des points que je suis heureuse d'avoir traité dans cette enquête, on s'aperçoit aussi qu'il y avait parmi eux des musulmans, plus invisibles, toujours dans l'ombre, dont parfois on ne connaît pas le nom, mais qui ont participé aussi à cette histoire savante.
There are also Muslim Arabic language instructors who are coming in who are more or less invisible in the sources for the same sorts of reasons that we're discussing here.
Et notamment dans le volume 2, j'ai travaillé sur les échanges entre la Provence et Tunis, disons, où un grand humaniste français du XVIIe siècle va chercher des traducteurs parmi les galériens de Toulon pour l'aider à traduire des inscriptions arabes.
And also in this second volume that just recently appeared in Dakhlia's chapter, looking at relations between Tunisia and Provence, the southeastern France, Mediterranean France. There's also a particular person named Darko, the person here? Darko. She does a really, it's not even a chapter, it's 100 pages. It's like a mini book in this big book. And this particular person was looking for translators among the Arabophone galley slaves. Right? So he was looking to bring these people into the translation as translators and language specialists and so forth.
Et si je peux.
Oui.
Et Peter Miller a travaillé sur Pérez, cet érudit français, et avait même remarqué qu'il avait un informateur qui était un berbère de Taroudant au Maroc.
Oh, okay. And also, Peter Miller done a study this particular person. He found that there was a Berberophone, a Arabophone.
Berberophone et arabophone, from Taroudant.
Who spoke Berber and wrote and spoke Arabic. They écrit l'arabe aussi?
Oui.
Okay, the educated Arabic, bilingual, from Morocco.
Translating numismatic inscriptions.
Oh, okay, with his Arabic inscriptions he was working on. I have a question that I like to ask. I'll ask in English if we need to. It's not that difficult. We'll do it in English. But I think the question of source is a really important one throughout this, and that the invisibility is largely an invisibility that exists in the written document. And Chloe's question, I think, in here in terms of physical differences, is appropriate to think about. It's a sort of purloined letter, it's sort of hidden in plain sight. These religious differences, and also the different ways in which religion may or may not have a physical dimension and may or may not have a way to express itself in a written source. It makes this work really, really challenging to do. And so I'm wondering if you go, as a state, as we move forward into the 19th century and the 20th century, when the state embarks upon this very robust project of classifying people, of providing papers for people, of establishing proper names. There are the new practices of namings that are implemented by the state in the 19th century, where you have parents, you have classes that are in an identity card. And this moment of when the identity card is born in the 19th century in France and other places about the same time. what changes in terms of the work of a historian for documenting religious minorities? I mean, certainly this is a moment of colonialism, as you talked about, and so this changes the geopolitical thing, the place of Islam and so forth. But in terms of the historian, the researcher, even a genealogist would face the same sort of projects, and it's a textual challenge of going forward. Does work become easier? What sort of, if you have any sort of experience with the more recent period, what would we find? It's a very interesting question because I'm looking for one of these guys at the beginning of the 19th century, a person from Algiers who lived in Marseille, took a French wife and started a family in Marseille before he moved back in the 1830s. He's completely invisible in the French archive at this time. I haven't found any trace of him, of his life in Marseille.
Oui, c'est étonnant parce que c'est un moment où justement ces personnages commencent à devenir plus visibles et à causer plus de problèmes. Ils sont aussi plus visibles par le costume, plus visibles par le nom. Alors, comparé avec le 19e siècle et le 20e siècle où l'état civil est une contrainte, ça m'est un peu difficile parce que d'abord j'ai voulu, c'est le sens de cette enquête, regarder avant la période coloniale, essayer de ne pas faire comme si tout commençait avec la colonisation. Donc c'est effectivement difficile d'avoir les deux points de vue.
So the response in many ways is determined by her own project, which is informed by trying to write an early history of this particular phenomenon, not focusing only as if this began with colonialism, the question of Islam in Europe and so forth, but it's something that predates that, has a very much longer history.
Alors bien sûr, quand il y a des sources d'état civil, c'est plus de confort pour l'historien. C'est une grande satisfaction pour lui. Même si nous avons aussi ce type de documents, par exemple sur les registres des galères, nous avons une description physique des individus, nous connaissons même leurs cicatrices.
Okay. And one of the important sources for and it comes out of the forced galley slaves and slave galley rowers is the fact that with this you have a sort of identity card that was produced when they were enslaved, which includes names and physical descriptions, including scars and so forth. Right, so there's a very detailed record that comes out of for the galley rowers.
Mais le problème de ces sources d'état civil du 19e ou du 20e siècle, c'est qu'elles figent l'identité et ne nous disent rien sur la labilité identitaire qu'il peut y avoir derrière.
Okay, I would translate that in terms of the identity card, which is what's called the état civil in France. An identity card, and it's actually much more than that. It's a very sophisticated apparatus of placing people and naming people and situating them in society, and most importantly, making them visible to the state. That also produces its own set of invisibilities. There are certain things that become visible. This is what the answer is. There are certain things that become visible, but also many things that are hidden in terms of what we would think about in terms of identity.
Donc les historiens doivent se méfier aussi.
But it's a problematic source, d'état civil as well. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful.